I saw some of you earlier this afternoon, and it's really nice to see you again. So I just want to say one thing, which is that I just want to emphasize one thing, which is that I did a PhD in art history and philosophy, and so the kind of work that I do in my writing, it's always informed by both of these things, and so that speaks to what I'm going to be talking about today, which is portraits. So I'm just going to begin with the paper. Maybe how do I?
It's the one on the right. Nope, sorry, the one on the left.
Okay, so I have this little handy lamp here. There we go. All right, so let us begin with a scene at the Royal Academy of Art in London in 1997. Picture, if you will, utter mayhem. Shattered glass, megaphones, placards, images of media manipulation, tears, confusion, bewilderment. And that's just in the courtyard. Inside the museum, a 44-year-old man from the West Midlands was apprehended after he kicked a picture from the wall and splattered it with 2 cartridges of ink. A few minutes later, a second man, also in his 40s, threw an egg onto the same picture. Now, these were no ordinary acts of vandalism. These men, like so many viewers before and after them, took profound moral offense at the picture in question. And this makes us wonder, what about this picture could have possibly been so bad? Now, before I tell you more about the particular picture, I want to say something about the context in which it was exhibited. So the picture in question was part of a show called Sensation, which was a notorious exhibition of the collection of contemporary art owned by Charles Saatchi, which included works by the so-called young British artists. Maybe some of you have heard about this. Works featured in this exhibition included, now here's a list. The Chapman's naked mannequins of children with erect genitalia and anuses on their faces. Chris O'Feely's Virgin Mary, made of dung and cutouts of pornographic photographs. Ron Muke's Dead Dad, a silicone and acrylic naked corpse on the floor. And Sarah Lucas's 2 fried eggs and a kebab, sculpted food resembling women's sexual organs on a table. Now, even in the context of that, right, of this doggedly and aggressively polemical collection of artworks, the picture that I'm talking about was singled out as especially morally offensive. After being restored from the attacks that I just mentioned, the picture was placed behind Perspex glass, bulletproof glass, and enjoyed the protection of its own dedicated security guard. The picture I'm referring to, oh, that is not it. The picture I'm referring to is a portrait, Marcus Harvey's Myra, a monochrome close-up depiction of Myra Hindley from the shoulders up. Myra Hindley, as you may know, along with her husband, Ian Brady Hindley, was convicted in 1966 of sexually assaulting and murdering 5 children in and around Manchester in England. These are the so-called, they were called at the time, the Moors murders. Now the painting is based on a well-known police photograph of a hard-faced Myra with bouffant bleach hair, taken sometime after her arrest in 1965. No, it couldn't be 1965, it must be 1966. The photograph was so widely circulated as to have become iconic, right? So her kind of mugshot, as it were. And this raises a question. If the photograph on which the painting that I was just talking about is based, if that photograph had not only circulated without complaint, but it even played a role in Hindley's public condemnation, then what could be wrong, and indeed so wrong, with a painted copy, or something like a painted copy of that photograph? So here I'm just going to show you. So here we have the photograph on your right and the painting on the left. this question. We need to understand what, if anything, makes a portrait amenable to moral judgment in the first place. What I mean by amenable to moral judgment, I mean, what makes a portrait the proper object of moral judgment, something that you could make a moral judgment about? Let me explain why that's a problem. What features or set of features allows us, and indeed calls for us, to direct moral condemnation or praise at a portrait? Or maybe there's no such feature, in which case the whole thing, the whole upsetness about the portrait of Myra, it just rests on a mistake. So these are questions that I'm going to be talking about. The notion that a portrait is properly the object of moral judgment may seem to you quite intuitive. However, the idea is rarely justified or explained, and it turns out that despite being intuitive and widely assumed, it's difficult to specify and explain what feature or cluster of features might make a portrait the proper target of moral judgment. Now, I wager that this is an endeavor worth undertaking because pinpointing what makes portraits the proper target of moral judgment will help us better understand the relationship ultimately between portraits and morality. In particular, how we conceive of the moral feature of portraits affects whether and how we think of portraits' moral valence, its kind of moral value, can have any aesthetic or artistic import. And those are questions that I work on more broadly. Professor Dow just mentioned a paper called Robust Immoralism, where I think a lot about the relationship between moral and aesthetic value. So what I'm interested in here is the way in which the nature of the moral features of a portrait can affect our understanding of the interaction between the moral features and the aesthetic features. I'm going to explain more of this as we go on. Okay, I'm not going to talk about those things today, about the relationship between aesthetic and moral value. But I'm going to set the stage for that by answering some questions about and thinking through what might make a portrait the proper object of moral judgment in the first place. Okay, so a skeptic about the moral judgment of portraits. So a skeptic is somebody who thinks you can't make moral judgments about portraits. A skeptic might begin by observing that moral judgment pertains primarily to persons and their actions and motives. So this is, for those of you who have had a moral philosophy class, this is just kind of a basic thing. Moral judgments are about actions and they're about persons. That's the realm, that's the proper home. Maybe about groups of persons, maybe about institutions, but those all kind of filter out from thinking about persons and how they act. That's what we do when we're thinking about moral judgment, regardless of whether you're, an Aristotelian or a Kantian or a consequentialist or whatever. And if none of that is something that you've heard of, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to build this case that for the skeptic who might think, look, we make moral judgments about persons, not about things. The skeptic concedes that, of course, we can make moral judgments about the persons depicted by portraits. Right? So, of course, I can make a moral judgment about Myra Hindley. She's a bad person. But that's making a moral judgment about who is depicted, not making a moral judgment about the picture itself. And those come apart. And so to make that clear, let me just give you an example. So consider the case of documentary photography, which depicts, shows us atrocities, but doesn't endorse them. You see, so I'm just trying to I'm using this example of documentary photography just to show you that there's what a picture does and there's what a picture represents. And you can make moral judgments about what the picture represents, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the picture itself has those properties. So documentary photography might document an atrocity, but the picture itself is not atrocious. In fact, maybe it's a morally good picture because it's bringing these atrocities to the world's attention, getting the world to do something about these atrocities. For example, it would be absurd to say that a picture depicting an atrocity is, for this reason alone, morally atrocious. Is this point making sense? Because we don't know each other, and so I may be using a lot of language that's unfamiliar. I'm curious. Keep going. Keep going, did you say? Yeah. You can, I feel very flexible about this, so if you have a question and you want to stop or something. Yeah, please.
On that note, are you making a distinction between documentary and photojournalism in photography?
No, I'm not. It was a simple point that, I mean, one could and one might. It was a simple point about, you could just imagine that, a picture of something terrible is itself not a terrible picture. So it wasn't, yeah.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for that question. So, back to the Myra picture. So our skeptic, the person who thinks that you can't make moral judgments about pictures, our skeptic wants to say something similar about Harvey's portrait of Myra. The moral failure lies with Myra herself, not with the picture of her. Those who attack and decry the painting, the people who are like throwing ink at it and stuff, they're mistaking their rage at Myra, the person, for rage at the picture of her. And that's a mistake, so the skeptic thinks. But this, our skeptic insists, is a mistake. The portrait and the person it depicts are conceptually, and we might say in philosophy, ontologically, they're different things. So is the skeptic right? What I'm going to do now is consider a variety of features that, of portraits that at least appear to make them proper candidates for moral judgment. The features I'm going to discuss are in this order. First of all, moral attributes of the artist. That's one thing. Second, moral attributes of the processes of making the portrait. And third, the portrait's effects in the world. So those are three candidates that we might consider. I'm going to go through them. After discussing each and finding each one a bit wanting, I'm going to settle on my own idea of what makes a portrait the proper target of moral judgment, and I'm going to consider some examples. I should say up front that I am open to being a pluralist about this matter. I don't think there has to be just one thing that makes a portrait a proper candidate of moral judgment, so I'm open to pluralism. But it'll be helpful for us conceptually to see the different options and then think about which ones are right, and they may interact, and there may be a lot of complexity. Okay, so the first one. So consider, for instance, the moral character of the person who made the portrait, the artist, right? So here's an example. So this is a bronze bust of Cosimo de Medici I from the mid-16th century, and it's by Benvenuto Cellini. Now, Benvenuto Cellini is an artist who was convicted in his day of murder and rape, and he wrote about it even. Does this somehow morally taint this portrait of Cosimo de Medici, who had nothing to do with any of Benvenuto Cellini's bad actions? To be clear, let me just make it clear, the issue is not whether Cellini's moral character affects the portrait's aesthetic character or value. So I'm not asking the question, can bad people make good portraits? I'm not asking that. I'm just asking the simpler, I think more foundational question, which is whether the moral character of the artist can serve as the thing that makes a portrait morally good or morally bad. That's the question I'm asking. So cases where the content of the work has nothing to do with the maker's moral flaws, as it does in this case, right? So Benvenuto Cellini, bad person, did bad things, has nothing to do with Cosimo de Medici, the person portrayed here in this bust. This can help us isolate the moral flaw as a potential source of the portrait's moral valence. So the question is, can the moral character of the maker serve as the thing? Our skeptic thinks not. She notes that in such cases, the moral evaluation in question targets the sorts of things that moral judgments usually target, namely a person, the person who made the portrait. But this is distinct, conceptually and ontologically, right? The person who made this portrait and this portrait, they're distinct things. Conceptually distinct and also ontologically, right? Right? One is a person, one is a portrait. They're completely different things. The character of the maker is not somehow magically transferred to the thing that she makes. After all, morally bad people produce all sorts of things that are not automatically morally tainted simply because their makers are flawed, no matter how deeply. It would be absurd to say that just because Hitler cooked them, the mashed potatoes are morally reprehensible. Right? The causal relationship is not, like moral character is not conferred, is the point. I myself find this line of reasoning compelling. But I do find it less persuasive in cases where the artist is still alive and productive. So, Benvenuto Cellini has been dead for almost 500 years. So, let's take a case where the artist is alive. All right, so this is a portrait, a self-portrait of Chuck Close by Chuck Close. So he's this artist. So these things are, I don't know. Has anyone seen any of Chuck Close's work? So can you say something about them? Like, how big are they, typically?
The one I saw was like 10 by 12, I think.
Yeah, they're like bigger than this. They're super big. And they have a kind of like photographic quality, although when you get close, you see that they're made up of lots of little pieces, pixels or dots or squares or some sort of thing. But when you move far away, they have this like really kind of photographic quality. Okay, he's a very famous artist. That's relevant. Okay, since last December 7th, women have started coming forward accusing Chuck Close of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. In particular, of pressuring them to pose in the nude and of making lewd remarks and sexual advances in the process. So any of you here who's ever taken a life drawing class know that it's completely not part of the culture and it is really totally unacceptable to make any kind of like sexual lewd remarks about the model or to touch the model or approach the model. That's, anybody taken a life drawing class here? You know, where I totally recommend this. It's an amazing experience to have a naked adult standing there and 10 people circling them, drawing them. It's a really, really interesting experience. But anyway, it's just not acceptable, ever, to like have any kind of sexual contact in these classes. Now, Close denies any sexual contact, but acknowledges speaking crudely to his female models about their bodies. And he issued something of an apology. I say something because he said, actually I put this here in a footnote, but I'll just read it to you. So he said, last time I looked, discomfort was not a major offense. I never reduced anyone to tears. No one ever ran out of the place. If I embarrassed anyone or made them feel uncomfortable, I'm truly sorry. I didn't mean to. I acknowledge having a dirty mouth, but we're all adults here. It sort of takes away the, I'm truly sorry, but then like the sort of like grow up at the end. So not a great apology. Okay, several institutions have responded forcefully to the allegations. In January of last year, Seattle University took his self-portrait off display, this one, and the National Gallery of Art canceled, or at least indefinitely postponed, a show dedicated solely to Close, containing 30 of his works. So that's what I mean about, like, he's a big deal. He's going to have a solo show with like 30 works at the National Portrait Gallery. The National Gallery of Art in DC. Now, these actions were, of course, controversial, and I don't have time to work through the controversy here. For our purposes, I just want to note one thing to be said in favor of the decision to not exhibit Close's work. Right, this is just one thing to be said in favor of it. Exhibiting Close's portraits, and in particular granting him solo exhibitions in prestigious museums, bestows, maintains, and enhances the very sort of power and prestige that he is abusing in, if it's true, sexually harassing his models. Right, so if you continue to show his work, you're continuing to prop up the power that he has, that he's allegedly abusing. Right, so you're directly part of a mechanism that's allowing him to, if it's true, get away with the sorts of things that he's doing. Further, once the allegations have become public, and more or less confirmed by Close himself, right? So he's not really denying, he's denying that he ever made anybody cry or run out of the room. But there are bad things that one can do that don't lead to that point, right? So he's basically acknowledged them himself. So once the allegations became public, refusing to respond, as some museums have, enhances the sort of climate, pervasive in Euro culture since at least the Renaissance, in which female models are routinely the targets of sexual harassment and abuse. So this, if you study European art history, this is like, I've said like in classes that you would take, it's not appropriate ever to make sexual, any kind of sexual comments or anything toward a model, but in the history of art, artists with models one-on-one, there's been routinely lots of documented harassment and abuse. So, back to my point. So we have good reason to refuse to display a portrait based on the moral flaws of the artist, I think. You see how that's working? But this is a limited claim, and it won't satisfy our skeptic for 3 reasons. First, it's decidedly not the same thing as saying that the portrait is morally flawed because of the maker's moral flaws, which is what we were after, right? Second, the concern is aimed at an artist's entire oeuvre, and the particularities of any individual work are irrelevant, right? I showed you a portrait of Chuck Close, but it could have been anything. So the content of the portrait just doesn't really matter here. And finally, the sort of concern just raised does not pertain to portraits in particular. It applies to any work. Anything that Chuck Close does, right? You shouldn't be, if the allegations are true, you shouldn't be showing them in any big museums. So, although Chuck Close gets us in the neighborhood of considering the artist's moral character, it's not going to answer the skeptic's worries. So let's turn to the second kind of case, where the process of making the portraits are morally meritorious, morally good, or morally tainted. Mightn't this redound to a portrait's moral flaws? Now, our skeptic will offer the same sort of reply she gave to the first kind of case. Processes of making are conceptually and ontologically distinct from the product. If it turns out to be true that the Great Pyramid of Giza was the product of slave labor, something that people used to say, looks like it's less, it's more and more looking like it's not true, but anyway, just it's a thing that people said for a long time. This wouldn't in any way condemn the structure itself, right? Maybe the pyramids of Giza were built through slave labor, but that doesn't mean that the pyramid is immoral. It's the process of making it, so the skeptic would say. Now, one can concede the skeptic's point without giving up on this line of thought. The Great Pyramid, after all, is not a picture, much less a portrait. In the case of portraits, we can find a tighter connection between what you might call the efficient cause. I'm using some Aristotelian language here. The efficient cause is the thing that brings something into being, and the effect, the picture itself. So here's an example. This is a photograph from Jill Greenberg's End Time series, and these are portraits of young children crying. I'll just show you a couple. I'll just go back to the first one with the snotty nose. The moral problem, the potential moral problem, is not just that the portraits are evidence of the fact that Greenberg was taking photographs rather than rushing to the aid of the children. Right? So instead of comforting the child, she was taking photographs, but that's not the only problem. There's a bigger problem, which is that Greenberg purposefully upset the children in order to make the portraits. So she had people come to the studio. It looks like, she gave the children like a candy or a toy, and then she snatched it from them. And children this age, when you snatch something that they like from them, they lose it. And then she started to take photographs. Right, so it's not like something, in the scale of moral wrongs, it's, mild compared to some of the things that she could have done to children to make them cry. She didn't hit them. But still, in a small child's world, when the toy is taken away or the candy is taken away or whatever, they feel bad. And so she purposefully upset these children just so she could make these really super compelling portraits. glossy, aestheticized portraits of these children. So maybe, in this case, where an artist deliberately causes suffering in order to capture and dramatize it, maybe this is a case in which a portrait is morally tainted because of the way it was made. Now, I think that this is right, although part of the problem may be that these portraits appear to take pleasure in the pain that they cause. Right, so it may be that like there's another piece to why these are disturbing, and that is that they are in some sense, in a deep sense, like aesthetically very compelling portraits. You know, with this like silky background and you know, the color and the light and all of the detail, and they're formally compelling. So that might be part of the problem, is that they're sort of making aesthetically compelling somebody's pain. And this, I think, is ultimately part of their artistic interest, what makes them interesting photographs. They encourage us to take visual pleasure in something as basically aversive as a child crying. Something that we're supposed to see as aversive. Right? If you look at a child crying and you don't feel bad, there's something wrong. That's pretty basic, right? And so we're supposed to see this as aversive, and yet at the same time attracting. So they're like simultaneously attracting and repelling, and that I think is what makes them interesting, artistically interesting. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Okay, I don't have time today to discuss the third candidate for a moral flaw, a portrait's effects on its audiences, but I'll just note three things. First, I don't think that you need to be a dogmatically committed consequentialist to care about the moral consequences of artworks. Right, so I'm thinking here about, you know, in the world of moral theory, consequentialism is one of the major moral theories that says that the moral value rests entirely on the consequences of something. I don't think you have to be that person to care about consequences, is what I'm saying. Second, while figuring out the effects of any form of representation whatsoever is a tremendously complicated issue, this fact alone is not a reason to dismiss correlations when considering the portrait's moral value. So just saying, you know, look, it's really complicated figuring out effects, maybe we should just leave it behind. That's not a reason. That just says it's really complicated and hard to figure out how artworks affect us. And finally, if you're interested in a portrait's effects as a locus of its moral valence, and it has been demonstrated that a portrait regularly has morally relevant effects in the world, you should still want to know whether the portrait is responsible for these effects. Right? So if it turns out that, you know, say people look at these and then go off and decide to start like robbing children of their candy in order to, you know, make something similar happen. There's an important question of whether the portrait is responsible, or we're talking about like a somewhat unbalanced person who has, you know, a poor sense of moral guidance, who's just, you know, going off and doing something. You know, so I mean, this comes up a lot in the copycat crime phenomenon. You know, people watch movies and then decide to go off and like imitate that. And there's a deep question about whether the movie prompted that, or we're talking about like, you know, the response of an unbalanced individual to the thing in question. So that's, I'm just saying that the whole consequences thing, it's really complicated. But here's the thing. Actually, here's what I wanted to say there. This gets me to the point that I'm interested in. So how do you know, there's this question about whether a portrait or any artwork is calling for a certain response. You know, is it reasonable to look at these and say, they're prompting you to go out and start stealing children's candy and toys? And that thought is important to me here, because I think that one really important way that a portrait can have a moral, what I was calling a moral valence, a moral value, lies principally in what I'm going to call its perspective on the person it depicts. I think all portraits adopt perspectives on their sitters. And in some cases, these perspectives make the portraits themselves properly susceptible to moral evaluation. So that's my view, that we can think about the perspective, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by that now. Oh. Okay, so it's through its perspective that a portrait can, for example, condone or condemn, glorify or demean, celebrate or humiliate, flatter or scorn, endorse or denounce. That's just like one list of things that a portrait can do to the persons it depicts, to the people represented. Since, as I noted at the start of this talk, a portrait's depict what we call depictive contents, what a portrait represents, or I should say who, since we're talking about portraits, whom a portrait represents. These are themselves subject to moral evaluation. And a portrait's perspective on that sitter would, at least in some cases, make the portrait properly susceptible to moral evaluation. So here's an example. Does anybody know who that is? That is Andrew Jackson. How did you know? It's a famous portrait.
Yeah, he has that big head and that crazy hair.
That crazy hair. That crazy hair. Okay, so this is a portrait of Andrew Jackson. Nice work. Anybody else? Did anybody else know? Be honest. The few, the crowd. By Ralph Eliezer Whiteside Earl from around 1836. This is in the National Portrait Gallery in DC, and I recently spent some time looking at it. So Jackson, as you know, signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which led to thousands of Native American deaths, as over 60,000 were forced to relocate west of the Mississippi, the Trail of Tears. Did the Trail of Tears
Right here.
came through here? Wow, is it marked here?
Yeah. There's the part, yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. I want to see that. Yeah, so Jackson was also a slave owner who bought well over 100 slaves in his lifetime. And as a president, supported slavery as an institution and did what he could to fight abolitionism. So I think it's fair to say, and indeed it's an understatement to say, that Andrew Jackson was a deeply morally flawed individual. But the portrait, this portrait, very strongly encourages admiration for Jackson. So this is what I mean about the perspective, right? There's a distinction between the character of who is shown and how they are shown. It's the how they are shown that I'm calling the perspective. This is in fact a good example of what I heard a curator at the National Portrait Gallery refer to as a swagger portrait. A swagger portrait is one where the sitter is shown in the grand manner, what is often called the grand manner, pictured above eye level, so as to enhance his stature, right? So where, our eye level here is, somewhere, I think, like about here. And so we're kind of looking up, enhancing his stature. Ostentatious posture, vast land holdings in the back there, dramatic clothing, and surrounding items connoting wealth, power, and learning. And that's like all of these things go into making this a swagger portrait. So in short, Earl's portrait calls upon us to view Jackson with approval, esteem, and admiration. And this, I think, is something we ought not do on moral grounds. We ought not approve of, esteem, and admire morally bankrupt persons. So we might say that this portrait has a morally flawed perspective. Right? So it's not simply the fact that somebody who is himself morally flawed is portrayed. It's not simply that. It's that he is portrayed from this perspective that calls upon us to admire and esteem him. That's the perspective that's morally problematic. Now maybe this seems obvious, but there's a real difficulty in explaining what one means by perspective, and then in explaining how a portrait can adopt one. And this is something that I'm kind of working on right now in my current project. So perspective has two related meanings. One is visual and the other is psychological. So So visually speaking, a person's perspective is what she sees from a particular location. And so linear perspective that we talk about in the history of art, for instance, is what is shown from a particular point. Linear perspective is always constructive from a particular vantage point. This means that perspective always implies a viewpoint, a place from which things are seen. The visual sense can be extended to a psychological sense, according to which perspective is an attitude toward or a way of regarding something. Right? So we say all the time, like, well, that's your perspective on this issue. I don't mean like what you're seeing. I mean how you're thinking about it, how you're regarding it, how you feel about it, how you're judging it, that sort of thing. That's the psychological sense. Whether explicit or not, a perspective organizes things according to values and norms, in this psychological sense. Portraits, I think, adopt perspectives in both of these senses. Obviously, in the more strictly visual sense of the term. So so when I'm saying like we're looking up at Andrew Jackson, we're seeing him from the front. Those are the visual senses, but they bleed into the psychological senses, right? So, looking up also is, we talk about this metaphorically, right? When you're looking up at someone, they're someone to admire in some way, someone who has power over you. That's what it is to look up to somebody, right? And you look up to somebody. So you can see how they can come together, the visual and the psychological senses. Okay, so portraits do this. The difficulty in attributing a portrait in the extended sense is that portraits don't make assertions, much less arguments. They don't have narrators in the way that films do, or novels do, to guide the viewer in her judgment, right? So there's nothing here that says no explicit statement that says this guy is awesome, right? There are no words there to guide you. It's all happening through visual language. And I should just say, in my field, this has led some people to deny that artworks can have a moral character. That pictures can, precisely because they can't guide you in that very explicit way. I just want to note here that although I presented this, it might sound like I was presenting this as a deficit. Pictures can't explicitly tell us how to respond or what we should think about people or how we should value them. I don't mean it that way. After all, simply asserting that someone is worthy of an emotional evaluative attitude is almost never effective. What I mean by that is my saying that's a great guy, this is a good person, or that's a bad thing. That's not an effective way of persuading someone. Propositions are not, in the case of emotions and evaluations of this sort that I'm interested in here, propositions, by propositions I just mean open declarations of things, don't do a lot of work. If I'm not already predisposed to endorse the attitude in question, it does almost nothing to assert that a person is dignified or admirable or despicable or low. What you need to do is get me to see the person as admirable or despicable or contemptible or whatever it is. You need to get me to see them from your perspective. And this, I think, is what portraits do. Do you see what I mean? So imagine, you have a friend and you say to me, that guy's a jerk. I mean, maybe I'll take it because I admire you. I'll take it, I believe that you believe that this person is a jerk, and I believe that you have good reasons. But it's not until you can get me to see the person as a jerk that I'm really going to endorse that kind of, what I was calling emotional evaluative response. And this is what I think portraits can do. So, let me see, how am I doing here? Wait. So maybe I should be wrapping up, is that right? Yeah. Okay, so maybe I'm not, maybe I was gonna tell you some stuff about what a perspective is, but maybe I've said enough. You let me know if I haven't. I'm just gonna tell you, like, so I said, you know, I think portraits are really good at getting us to see people in certain ways, and they do this through visual language. So I'm just gonna give you some examples and talk about some of the ways that this works. I think that'll be good. So the first one is thinking about formal features. So this is the kind of thing that you study in like art history and in art classes. I'm talking about like composition, line, color, texture, light and dark. You know, these are really powerful ways that pictures have to get us to see people in certain ways. So, sorry, I'm just going to go back. You know, so just, you know, I was just talking about some of them here. You know, thinking about, you know, the prominence of this vertical here enhanced by the column, and the way that we're looking up at him, and a kind of like amazing rosy glow in the background. These are just some examples of formal features that are part of like, you know, presenting him in this really admirable way. And then there's this thing that sometimes we call intertextuality, which is the way that pictures can refer to other pictures and draw on long traditions of showing things in certain ways. And so I mentioned this thing about swagger portrait. And so here's just an example. Oops, sorry, I'm running. So this is Velasquez's picture of Philip IV, Habsburg, you might note by the chin. And you can just see the similarity between that and here, for instance, we have Van Dyck. And this is like the consummate swagger portrait. You know, and you can really see similarities in the language and the posture and other sorts of things between these three. And there's a long tradition of the so-called swagger portrait. Size. So size matters. Size matters in these kinds of cases. So like, you know, note, like, you know, what I had said early on, like, why was it that the mugshot, like, which is widely circulated, didn't upset people, but this portrait did? Look how big it is. That's part of it. You know, there's something about a large size portrait that itself just connotes like admiration, importance, something like that. And I think that's an important part of this here. And I think it's part of what really upset people about it. And then the other thing is the stuff about the processes of production. So this is where the thing from the Greenberg portraits is kind of coming back. So one of the things about Myra, does anybody know like how this thing was made? So you can tell it's like in the kind of like Chuck Close, like it's photographic, but it's made of like small parts. You know, it's kind of like pixelated. Can you sort of see that here? And so he made the entire image, I believe the entire image, using plaster casts of children's hands. And so he built it up from like, so the pixels are plaster casts of children's hands. So remember what I told you about what it is that they did. So that's a little bit like the processes of production. Let me see if hold on. I think I have can we see them here? Or, well, there you go. Yeah, that's the whole portrait. Yeah. So, and I mean, you know, and I mean, it's just, it goes on, right? Like finger painting, the kind, you know, like children and finger painting and this buildup of children's hands and like, so it's, you know, it's really, the process of production, it's a little bit, I mean, there's a suggestion that, you know, the portrait was made finger painting style, built up by children themselves. And that's pretty tough, yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what was like the artist's statement with this piece? Or
I know. I should. Do you? Does anybody? Well, so here, let me finish with this thought and then tell me what you think I should know, and I don't. So I want to finish with a brief comparison, and then I'm done. That's a good question, and I'm going to bring it around to, I don't know the answer, but I'm going to bring it around. So I want to finish with a brief comparison of these two. So Myra is an example of what I've called in some work that I write an intrinsically immoral work. Intrinsically. So here's what I mean. I mean, negative moral judgment is among the responses that we're supposed to have. Right? We're supposed to be horrified by the portrait's apparent approval of Myra and its apparent having been made out of the hands of, the finger painting hands of children. If you look at that portrait and you're just like, yeah, that's great, that's cool. You're missing it. You're just missing it. Right? It's supposed to be morally horrifying. And in the case of Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, moral judgment is extrinsic. Right? It's because of who I am, when I live, my politics, that I see him as a morally bankrupt figure. And so see the approval of him as morally flawed. But I'm not supposed to see this as morally flawed. I'm supposed to look at this and be like, Andrew Jackson, he was such a great man. It's just that I'm the wrong time, wrong person, wrong audience for that. So that's why I'm calling it extrinsically morally flawed. It's something that I'm bringing to the work. The judgment that this approbatory perspective that the Andrew Jackson has is morally flawed is something that I'm bringing to the portrait because I strongly disagree with Andrew Jackson. So the question that I want to explore as I develop this project that I'm working on is whether and how intrinsic moral flaws might be artistic virtues. This is a little bit related to what I was saying about the Greenberg thing. So it might be like artistically and aesthetically interesting that this work is so morally abhorrent, but not in this case. Not a matter of artistic interest, because I'm not supposed to find it morally abhorrent. I just happen to. So that's the thing I want to discuss with you, you can discuss whatever you'd like, but I would be interested to hear your thoughts about that or anything else. Thank you very much for listening, and let's talk.
Turn the lights on.
Oh, we can turn lights on. Unless you want to, oh. There's a funny thing about, it's like a kind of disciplinary, disciplinary difference that art historians are used to talking and giving papers in the dark. And philosophers, we're a little uncomfortable by that. It feels weird. So, yeah. So now we can all see each other. So why don't we go back to, did you find out what he said? What does he say? You have a report.
So I've been reading what Marcus Harvey had to say.
Wait, you weren't
about
on
it.
your phone earlier when you knew it was Andrew Jackson, right? That was real.
No.
Okay.
I knew it.
All right, I just want to make sure.
Well, he had two statements. The first one was he said, the whole point of the painting is the photograph, the iconic power that has come to it as a result of years of obsessive media reproduction. And then it said, this is off Wikipedia, it said he also commented, I know enough to know that she probably didn't do any of the murders, that she was just in a relationship where she was probably too attached to the man who was doing it to extricate herself. That her life was probably too dull and boring to throw the relationship away. I don't believe that's 30 years worth of reputation as one of the most vile and notorious murderers in British criminal history.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, you know why that last one is so interesting? I've always wondered about this portrait. There's this violent reaction. But I mean, she was the accomplice. He's the one who was raping and murdering. I'm not saying that it's good to be an accomplice to someone who's doing that. She was setting it up and helping him find the kids and stuff. But she's, it's interesting that the woman gets all the hate and all of this, and then he picks her out because he picked her. I mean, this is the thing. When artists say stuff like that, they're especially these young British artists, the so-called young British artists, it is on purpose inflammatory. Listen to the stuff, listen to the exhibit that I described that this was a part of. Statues of sculpture of young children with erect penises and anuses on their faces. I mean, it's all of this stuff is super inflammatory. So I don't believe him when he says that. But then there is this other question about why the woman is the really inflammatory one when in fact you know, the person who is committing the horrific crimes was the guy. Yeah, so that's in that. So one of them I don't believe, and the other one I find interesting. What do you think? Or what does anybody think?
My thoughts are.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I'm really glad you asked about it, and thank you for finding it. I think that's really interesting. Tell me.
Oh, go for it.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
All right.
We can take turns.
I mean, if the point of the artist, what's the artist's name again?
Marcus Harvey.
Oh, Marcus Harvey.
If Harvey was you know, digging at the fact that the woman who was merely an accomplice to the man who was mainly doing all of the atrocious things, not that it is terribly morally reprehensible to be complicit in something such as that, if the point is to be inflammatory, to examine why, why is this person being, demonized more so than, was it her husband? Or
Yeah, her
partner?
husband, yeah.
Yeah, than whoever was actually doing it. Why is it perhaps that she was just a woman that earns her all of this ire? So of course, I mean, it's like Harvey knew using handprints that would be incredibly disturbing, and perhaps had to know on some level that it was gonna, that art piece might have been, attacked or destroyed. But if their goal was to ask a question about sort of how we respond to it and perhaps our errant morality or judgment,
Yeah.
then they're starting the conversation right now. So it does something. It has a moral effect that I would argue is positive.
Yeah, so I love this question. I love this comment because there is this really deep and difficult question about how we are supposed. I was using this language like we're supposed to find this outrageous, and how we decide how we're supposed to respond to a work is really hard, and to my mind takes a lot of training. Like this is the kind of thing that art historians and art critics do. They make a case for a picture based on like detailed material analysis, historical analysis. Sometimes they look at what artists say, a whole bunch of things, and it's not easy, right? Like it's not like the message. I mean, this is what I love about pictures. This is why I love the visual arts. And this is also true for the literary arts. They're complicated. Right? It's also true for philosophical works, right? Like it's not like there's a single interpretation that's obviously right and boom, you can just discover it and we're done, right? So it's like, how do we know? I mean, is this a work that raises consciousness about gender and what men can get away with and what women can get away with? I mean, I honestly don't see it myself in the work. I see it in like, I read the comment and then I start thinking about it. I don't see it in the work. And I feel more drawn to the idea that it's supposed to be like, especially with those little hands, like super inflammatory. But we can have a discussion about it, I don't see a single thread of evidence in the painting that prompts me to have a complicated discussion about gender and what men get away with and what women get away with. Do you?
No, but I think it's impossible. I think that, well, and perhaps you could say that art history is founded on this one question, but I would argue that but art history does not exist in a vacuum. And Harvey could have done this knowing this is going to get attention, which is going to propagate a message. The fact that we're having this conversation now is evidence to the fact that it does have that effect. Because although the portrait inherently as paint, as a collection of, what it is itself, it doesn't exist that way in the world. It exists in the context of the creator, the statement, and this discussion.
Isn't it? And it's like a related point that I think is important here. I mean, I think that's really interesting, and I think that's right. And the whole kind of, I'm going to call it a movement, but that's too constricted. I mean, but let's say the whole phenomenon of transgressive art that's like deliberately trying to like push your buttons, make you angry, make you upset, is really a recent one. I mean, there are in at least in the European tradition. I'm just using European broadly, like European and the United States. There have been a few artists here and there. Maybe I'm thinking about like in the Renaissance there was Caravaggio, or like there were some, but it's really a modern phenomenon that people people started making artworks to like make you angry, make you upset, taunt you. You know, the famous ones are like Marcel Duchamp, Andy Warhol. You know, Marcel Duchamp's like, and here's my urinal, and there's my artwork, and you know, it's almost like he's giving you the middle finger the whole time, you know, or, you know, so they're, you know, and seeing the history of that, and then looking at this and that history, and the whole young British artist I think it like builds even more of a case that he's like, whatever it is he says, he's deliberately trying to upset us and morally affront us. And there's a whole tradition of, you know, by the time he made this, that artists have been doing that for over 100 years in different ways, you know. Yeah, really interesting. Let me see, you had your hand up, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for the talk, and I thought it was just really great the kind of close analysis you were doing, perspective, and how sort of within the frame we're being oriented to these individuals. And I just have a sort of broader question maybe about your method and the larger project, but what do you think the role is of the institution in orienting us to these works of art? I'm thinking like the question about captions or placement in a museum, or the role of the curator, and the perspective there, and the question of morality in that context.
Yeah, that's great. I love it. I mean, I love the question. I think so complicated. I'll just say a couple of things. So there are, and this is a thing that philosophers of art think about is, you know, what counts as the work? So does the title count as part of the work or not? And then there's a question about, you know, sometimes captions, they include statements from artists. Is that like part of what, you know, I said, like, oh, I wouldn't have known this about this unless I read, you know, unless you read to me this thing where he says like, oh, well, you know, it was her husband, not her, and we're trying to raise awareness about that. And I say, well, that's not part of the work, but like, you know, that went by pretty fast. One could ask questions about that, like, where do you cut the work? What counts as the work itself, right? And then there's this tremendously interesting question about display and the role, all of these things that go into display. And there's been some really great work on the ethics of display and just thinking about the ethics of curation and stuff like that that are super important. And I just like, yes, absolutely. You know, and there's like, I mean, here's just a pretty different kind of example. So Donald Trump moved an Andrew Jackson back into his office, right? You know, right there in the Oval Office, right? Is that right? Yeah. So, you know, moving that painting back into that space at this time means a lot. Like, so location, who did it, all of that, right? It's just one example of a kind of curation that says a kind of curation move, and the place where it ended up is a huge thing. But you know, some of you maybe know people who work as curators. I mean, it's and you know, and the people who work on setting up works in museums. I mean, there's a ton of thought and work that goes into that. Where to hang it, what color wall, how to light it, what the caption's going to look like, where you're going to put the caption. I was in a museum once a long time ago in Aachen, which used to be Aix-la-Chapelle now in Germany, and I was in this like modern art museum, and they did this really cool thing, which is they had it just had caption with the artist and date, that's it, not like a whole big explanation, and they just put it like tiny and down here at the floorboard, so that you had to like really work. But like, I work in a museum for a summer, and I noticed that, you know, one thing that people do in museums is typically they like walk up and they look at the picture like, yeah, and then they go over and they like read the caption, and then they stand back, and then they walk away. And it's like the caption gets more time than the picture, you know, which is why someone would do something like that. But there's like a whole really interesting question about that. So I really agree, totally. And if anybody's interested in some of the display literature, something I like and I can tell you about. So, yeah, please. No. Please.
Yeah, I'm still worried about your, what was it, the external?
Oh, I was calling it extrinsic, right? So this is an example of extrinsic immorality, and this is intrinsic immorality.
Yeah, so the extrinsic, I don't see any problem with talking about that in terms of moral because that's the way that you react and you're a person
Yeah.
reacting. But
Yeah.
I'm having more trouble with the intrinsic. I mean, you can have a portrait that is portraying something that's immoral, or you could have a portrait that portrays something moral. But I'm not sure, I'm more the skeptic, is that the painting that's
Yeah.
moral or immoral, or is it just that agrees with my moral standards,
Right.
so it's presenting something moral to me,
Right.
fine.
Right.
But that's not in the object itself, so I
Right.
wanna push a little bit on the
Yeah, thank you, you're my
skeptic
skeptic.
side.
I mean, I want to say that the skeptics, what I was calling the skeptic's voice, I feel it very keenly. Like, I think there's really, that position, that cluster of positions was for a while in philosophy and aesthetics, philosophy of art and aesthetics was kind of poo-pooed and made fun of, but I think there's something, I have always thought there's something really deep to that challenge, you know? And so I just want to say back, like, so here we have two cases. But I wanted to compare these. We have two cases of pictures of bad people, people who have done bad things. Let's for the moment just bracket how bad. Let's just say, and if you don't agree with me, at least like follow me here to stipulate. These people both have done bad things. Now, one of these pictures, I think, you're supposed to think of them as having done bad things. And you're supposed to see that the picture is a kind of glamorization of them. And you're supposed to be angry about that. And the other one, you're not supposed to see them as a bad person. You're supposed to see them as like a really great person who did great things, which is, you know, apparently how Donald Trump thinks of Andrew Jackson. But that's not how I think about him. And so I find fault with this picture for presenting a bad person in a flattering light. But that's what I'm supposed to do with this one. You know, I think what Marcus Harvey wanted was like, you know, people like throwing paint at your picture and stuff, that's great. It's like, you know, that like wants to provoke, you know, wants to make you angry. You can get people to the point where they're like tearing your pictures down and kicking them, you've done something right in his book, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, but I'm still, that may be the effect that he wanted to get from you, but
Yeah.
that's an effect, and then it's your reaction to it,
Yeah.
but it's not the painting itself that's immoral or moral. It's just a good painting because it's saying, it's getting you to understand what the artist wanted you to understand.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted you to be mad, and I don't know if he wanted you to throw ink on it, that may have been, but they just shredded that one just for fun.
So I have a response over here.
Well, my question is just more, what do you do to add maybe another layer to, what do you do with like something like a work by Gauguin that depicts one of his like pubescent wives? You know, Gauguin married, what was it, two 14-year-olds and a 13-year-old when he was in Tahiti?
After having deserted him.
Yeah, and then, yeah, he gave them
Another important part of this story.
Yeah, and so it's like, what do we do with a portrait of one of those wives by him? He didn't think that he was doing anything wrong, but he's, you know, encapsulating this like horrible act that he committed.
Yeah.
And especially there's the one of his wife dying. I can't remember the name of it. But what do you do with something like that?
Isn't that one the like laying down and there's black and then like
Yes.
the figure? Is she dying? I didn't know.
I
that.
think she's dying there, yeah.
Is she dying of syphilis?
I'm fine.
Syphilis that he brought to that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, Gauguin's troubled figure. Wait, so how does that, I mean, doesn't that just fit in this camp? Or no, it doesn't. Wait, yeah, say more. I see. I'm not thinking about this right. Say more.
No, I'm not
Yeah,
quite
sure.
sure. I'm just because he didn't think that what he was doing was morally
Right.
wrong.
Yeah.
And I don't think the public at that time would have necessarily read it as that because they were othered.
Yeah.
But those of us contemporary
Yeah.
audience would definitely regard
I mean,
those.
so it's a atrocities committed on the peoples who were here first, and the peoples who were brought here to, forced into slavery. And, it's like with hindsight about all of those things that we look at him and say, like, really bad person. So it has that kind of a similarity, but it does seem like, the interesting thing, and this is a little bit related back to the point about, like, how much do you need to know that's like part of the picture or not part of the picture, right? Is like, you know a big story about Gauguin. He deserted his family to go off and like be a painter, and then he took a bunch of like, pubescent women as wives and infected people with syphilis, and there are a bunch of really big problems there that aren't part of the painting, right? They're part of the like story that we know about him. And that seems like a really good example of a way, but they're related to the content of the picture, right? So it's not like the Benvenuto Cellini, Cosimo de Medici case. It's like they're related to the content of the picture in some way. That's a really interesting, deep, problematic case.
You didn't write on it, did you? No, okay. Somebody wanted my.
Somebody else want to say something? We're having a nice little discussion here, so maybe, tell me your name?
Maddie, sorry.
Maddie.
So this is a question about, piece right there. I was wondering, was the husband's mugshot circulated or nearly as iconic? Like, in a cultural understanding?
I don't think so. It's hard to say now because we've got this. Like, I can't picture him.
So,
I'm not British, and I wasn't living in, so I'm not the best test case, and it's, there's this too.
so I was thinking, like, in which case would this change? Like, if that was the surrounding context, would that change the morality of the portrait?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of had thoughts on one of them, but it was,
Yeah, that's a good question.
if he wanted to comment, like he said in his artist statement, on how she's getting all the blame for this one thing, if in fact there was no depiction, like there wasn't this image of the man in popular culture, then having him be conspicuously absent from the portrait itself kind of undermines that. So I agree with you, like not seeing that thread from his artist statement.
It seems like if that were what you were going for, somehow there would have been like an inclusion of the man's picture, some kind of, some kind of interesting artistic way of getting you to think about the two of them together and why it was more iconic, if that's true or not. Yeah.
And if they were both
Yeah, thank
equally,
you.
and I was gonna say if they were both like equally iconic,
Yeah.
then I had something like that.
Yeah. No, that's a great question.
Well, we've come to the end. Let's thank Dr. Eaton.
Oh.